The helicopter settled onto the dusty landing zone just after sunrise, its rotor wash throwing sand across rows of parked vehicles and canvas shelters. Soldiers barely looked up. Replacements arrived every few weeks. Some stayed, some didn't. Among the handful stepping off the aircraft was a young woman carrying 2 heavy packs and a medical rucksack that looked almost as large as she was. Her name tape read, Morgan. She wasn't much older than 26. She stood a little over 5'6", her dark hair tucked tightly beneath her patrol cap. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who understood exactly how much equipment she carried without needing to adjust it every few steps. Most people noticed something else. She didn't look like the kind of person assigned to one of the Army's hardest infantry platoons operating in a remote mountain valley. Staff Sergeant Tyler Brooks noticed first. He folded his arms. "That's our replacement medic." The logistics clerk checked the clipboard. "Specialist Evelyn Morgan." Brooks frowned. "They've got to be kidding." Nearby soldiers exchanged glances. "I thought we were getting someone from the Ranger Medical Company." "So did I." Another private smirked. "Maybe paperwork got mixed up." Nobody bothered lowering their voices. Morgan heard every word. She simply continued walking toward headquarters without changing pace. Inside the command tent, Captain Daniel Reeves studied the transfer packet with growing frustration. "This file can't be right." His executive officer leaned over the desk. "What's wrong?" "Everything." Reeves flipped through another page. 3 years in service. Combat medic qualification. Excellent evaluations. No disciplinary actions. No previous deployment history listed. The executive officer raised an eyebrow. "No deployment?" "None." Reeves sighed. "We're about to begin the biggest clearance operation this brigade has attempted all year, and headquarters sends me someone who's never seen combat." He closed the folder. "I requested experience." Outside, Morgan waited without complaint. When she was finally called inside, Reeves barely looked at her before speaking. "Specialist Morgan." "Sir, I'll be direct. I expected someone with a stronger operational background." "I understand, sir." Her answer came calmly. No defensiveness, no apology. Just acknowledgement. Reeves continued. "Our platoons have been taking casualties every week. This isn't a place to learn." "I know, sir." The captain looked up. "You know?" "Yes, sir." For just a second, something about her expression seemed unusual. Not fear, not confidence, recognition. As though she'd heard those exact words before. Then it disappeared. Reeves slid the paperwork across the desk. "You'll be attached to 2nd Platoon. They've lost 2 medics this deployment." Morgan nodded once. "I'll do my job, sir." Nothing more. No speech. No attempt to impress anyone. She saluted and left. After she was gone, the executive officer shrugged. "Maybe she'll surprise us." Reeves looked unconvinced. "I hope so." 2nd Platoon wasn't interested in giving her much of a welcome. Their patrol base sat on the edge of rocky hills where enemy fighters regularly watched every movement from distant ridge lines. The platoon had spent months together. Morgan was an outsider. Private Mason Carter was the first to speak. "So you're the new medic?" "Yes." "You ever been shot at?" "No." Several soldiers laughed. "Great. Exactly what we needed." Another soldier, Specialist Nolan Price, leaned against a truck. "Can you at least start IVs without fainting?" Morgan met his eyes. "Yes." He waited for more. There wasn't any. Price chuckled. "This one's quiet." Someone else added, "Probably because she knows she's in over her head." The conversation drifted elsewhere. Morgan simply began organizing the medical supplies assigned to her vehicle. Every pouch, every tourniquet, every bandage, everything had a place. She unpacked the entire aid bag and repacked it from memory in less than 15 minutes. Corporal Isaac Bennett watched from nearby. "You've done that before." She zipped the bag closed. "A few times." He nodded slowly. Most new medics spent days figuring out where everything belonged. She hadn't looked once at the inventory list. That afternoon, the platoon conducted equipment inspections. Everyone complained about the heat. Morgan said almost nothing. She checked every soldier's individual first aid kit. Some were missing supplies. Others had expired chest seals. One soldier rolled his eyes. "They're probably fine." Morgan handed the kit back. "They're not. You can request replacements." He laughed. "You think we'll actually use this stuff?" She looked directly at him. "I hope not." There was something unusually sincere in the way she said it. The soldier stopped smiling. As evening approached, helicopters began delivering supplies to the base. One of the aircraft landed only 100 yards away. Morgan glanced toward it for less than a second before returning to her work. The helicopter crew climbed out. Among them was a gray-haired chief warrant officer with decades of flight patches stitched across his uniform. He spotted Morgan immediately. His expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough that anyone paying close attention might notice. Instead of continuing toward headquarters, he walked directly toward the medical station. Several mechanics greeted him. He barely acknowledged them. Morgan stood as he approached. For the first time all day, someone else spoke before she did. "Specialist Morgan." "Chief." The older pilot extended his hand. "It's good to see you again." She shook it. "You too, sir." Brooks happened to witness the exchange while walking past. He frowned. The chief warrant officer knew everybody important on this base. He rarely remembered junior enlisted soldiers, yet he clearly recognized Morgan immediately. The two exchanged only a few quiet words. Nothing unusual, nothing revealing. Then the pilot smiled. "I'll see you around." "I'll be here." He nodded once before leaving. Brooks watched him disappear toward headquarters. Price wandered over. "You know who that was?" Morgan resumed sorting supplies. "Yes." "You served together?" "No." "Then how do you know him?" She tightened another strap on her aid bag. "We've met before." "Where?" She looked up briefly. "A long time ago." Price waited. She returned to her work. Conversation over. That night, the platoon gathered around folding tables eating reheated field rations. Morgan sat near the edge, quietly reading the next day's mission briefing while finishing her meal. Across the table, Carter lowered his voice. "You notice something?" "What?" "She doesn't ask questions." Price shrugged. "Maybe she's nervous." "No." Carter shook his head. "Nervous people talk." "She doesn't." Another soldier joined in. "Maybe she's trying to act tough." Brooks overheard them. "Doesn't matter. If she keeps up with us tomorrow, fine. If not." He didn't finish. Everyone understood. Second platoon had no patience for weak links. Later that evening, Bennett walked toward the supply shelter carrying spare batteries. He found Morgan sitting alone outside the aid station. She wasn't reading. She wasn't using her phone. She was studying a topographical map spread across a folding table. Not tomorrow's patrol route. The entire valley, every ridgeline, every dry riverbed, every abandoned compound. She had marked nothing, simply memorizing. Bennett stopped. "You expecting a test?" Morgan looked up. "No." "Then why memorize the whole valley?" She folded the map carefully. "It helps." "How?" "You notice patterns." "What kind?" "The kind that matter later." He laughed softly. "That's vague." She offered the smallest hint of a smile. "I know." Before Bennett could ask another question, the base loudspeaker announced the morning operational briefing. Morgan gathered the map with practiced precision. As she walked away, Bennett noticed something odd. She never once looked down to avoid the rocks scattered across the dark ground. It was as if she'd already memorized every step. He couldn't explain why that bothered him. It simply did. By sunrise, 2nd Platoon would leave the wire on its most dangerous mission in weeks. Most of the soldiers were worried about the enemy waiting somewhere beyond the mountains. None of them realized the biggest mystery was already walking beside them. The convoy rolled out before first light. Engines rumbled quietly through the darkness while the mountains stood like black walls against the fading stars. Dust hung low behind the armored vehicles, and every soldier inside knew the routine. Weapons had been checked twice. Radios were tested. Medical equipment was secured. No one expected the day to be easy. Most expected contact. Morgan climbed into the last mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle with 2nd Platoon. She secured her aid bag between her boots and performed one final inspection of every medical pouch without looking down. Across from her, Private Mason Carter watched with folded arms. "You always check everything this many times?" She fastened one final buckle. "I check until I'm certain. We're only going on a patrol." She met his eyes. "That's usually when people get hurt." A few soldiers exchanged amused looks. Price smirked. "She's optimistic." No one laughed very hard. Something about the way she had answered made the joke fall flat. Captain Reeves stood beside the lead vehicle as the convoy prepared to leave. He climbed onto the running board and addressed the platoon. "Intelligence believes insurgents have been moving supplies through the Western Valley. Our mission is reconnaissance. If we're lucky, nobody even knows we're there." Brooks quietly muttered to the soldiers nearest him. "That usually means the exact opposite." Several nodded. The convoy began moving. Within minutes, the base disappeared behind the ridgeline. Only dust and mountains remained. The Western Valley was deceptively peaceful. Goats wandered across distant hillsides. A few abandoned stone houses overlooked dry riverbeds. The morning breeze carried almost no sound. Lieutenant Aaron Mills studied the terrain through binoculars. "Looks quiet," Brooks answered without lowering his rifle. "Too quiet." Morgan remained silent. She wasn't watching the road. She was watching the hills. Every few seconds her eyes shifted between rock formations, dry washes, and clusters of shrubs. Price noticed. "What are you looking for?" "The ground." "The ground." She nodded. He leaned toward the window. "I don't see anything." "I know." That answer irritated him. An hour later, the vehicle stopped near an abandoned farming compound. 2nd Platoon dismounted and spread into security positions while engineers examined the nearby road. Morgan immediately began checking fields of fire, casualty collection points, and possible evacuation routes. Not because anyone had instructed her, because she simply did it. Corporal Bennett noticed. "You've been here before?" "No." "Then how'd you know where to stand?" Morgan glanced toward a narrow depression running alongside the road. "If someone gets hit," she pointed toward a stone wall, "we can stabilize them there." Then toward another opening. "Helicopters could land over there." Finally, she looked toward a ridgeline. "And that's where I'd expect someone to observe us from." Bennett slowly followed her line of sight. The ridge overlooked nearly the entire valley. He hadn't noticed it. "You think someone's up there?" "I don't know. But if I were planning an ambush..." She stopped herself. "I'd want that view." Bennett looked again. Nothing moved. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that she might be right. The engineers finished their inspection. "No explosives." The platoon continued on foot. Morgan walked near the center of the formation, never speaking unless someone addressed her. Private Carter whispered to Price, "I swear she walks like she's counting steps." Price looked. She wasn't admiring the scenery. She wasn't distracted. Her eyes moved constantly. Left, right, ahead, behind, steady, measured. "She's probably just nervous," Price said. But he didn't sound convinced anymore. Near midday, the platoon stopped beside a dried creek bed. The soldiers removed their helmets and drank water while Brooks reviewed the next phase of the patrol. Morgan walked several yards away and crouched beside the dusty ground. She brushed away loose sand with her glove. Bennett wandered over. "What did you find?" She pointed. "Boot prints." He looked down. "I don't see anything." She traced a shallow impression barely visible in the dirt. "Here. And here." He squinted. "You can tell all that?" "They're recent." "How recent?" She studied the soil for another moment. "Maybe 2 hours." "You serious?" He looked around. "There aren't even clear tracks." Morgan stood. The wind almost erased them. Brooks approached after noticing the conversation. "What is it?" Morgan stepped aside. I think people crossed here. Brooks knelt. After nearly a minute, he finally noticed the faint impressions. You sure these aren't ours? She shook her head. No. Different tread pattern. Brooks frowned. You can identify boots from this? I think so. The staff sergeant called one of the scouts over. The scout examined the prints. After another minute, he looked up. She's right. Not ours. Brooks slowly stood. When? Couple hours. Exactly what Morgan had estimated. Price stared at her. You guessed that? No. I observed it. The atmosphere changed. Nobody openly mocked her now, but nobody quite understood her either. As the patrol continued deeper into the valley, conversations became quieter. Every soldier found himself occasionally looking toward Morgan. She never seemed hurried, never appeared uncertain. She simply moved with deliberate efficiency. Around mid-afternoon, the platoon approached a narrow pass between two steep hills. Morgan slowed. Something caught her attention. She wasn't looking ahead. She was listening. The wind. Nothing more. She raised her head slightly. Brooks noticed. What? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she scanned the ridgelines, then the rocks, finally the empty road. I don't like this. Brooks looked around. What don't you like? I don't know. That's not helpful. I know. She hesitated. Something feels wrong. Price sighed loudly. Seriously? We're making tactical decisions based on feelings now. Morgan ignored him. Brooks studied the terrain. There was nothing obvious. No movement, no radio intercepts, no visual contact. Still, he ordered the point team to halt for a minute, mostly to satisfy himself. Nothing happened. After several moments, Price smiled. Guess we're good. Brooks nodded. Move. The formation resumed. Morgan followed without another word. She never once said, I told you so. Less than 5 minutes later, the platoon reached the center of the pass. A shepherd appeared on a distant hillside with a small flock of goats. Most soldiers barely noticed him. Morgan did. She stopped walking. The shepherd wasn't watching his animals. He was watching the platoon. His radio antenna briefly reflected sunlight before disappearing beneath his robe. Morgan's expression changed for the first time since arriving at the base. Not fear. Recognition. She immediately turned toward Brooks. Staff Sergeant. He looked back. What? We need to leave. Why? Now? What did you... She never finished. The shepherd disappeared behind the rocks. Morgan kept staring at the empty hillside. Brooks followed her gaze. You know him? No. But I've seen that before. What? The signal. Brooks reached for his radio. Before he could speak, a transmission interrupted him. Second platoon, this is Overwatch. The voice sounded tense. We've lost visual on several suspected enemy positions. Brooks answered immediately. Copy. Then he looked back toward the hill. The shepherd was gone. No goats, no movement, nothing. Morgan quietly adjusted the straps on her medical bag. She wasn't panicking. But for the first time all day, her right hand rested near the tourniquet pouch instead of hanging at her side. Bennett noticed. He had a feeling she wasn't preparing for the possibility of casualties. She was preparing because she expected them. Brooks didn't like uncertainty. The shepherd's disappearance bothered him far more than he wanted to admit. Increase spacing, he ordered over the radio. 10 meters between each man. Stay alert. The platoon adjusted immediately. No one complained. Even Price, who had been skeptical of Morgan all morning, scanned the ridgelines more carefully now. Morgan remained near the center of the formation. Her eyes never stopped moving. She wasn't looking only at the high ground anymore. She was watching the soldiers. Who was exposed? Who was tired? Who had drifted too far from cover? It was the kind of awareness people usually developed only after years in combat. The narrow pass finally opened into a broad valley dotted with crumbling stone walls and abandoned terraces. Lieutenant Mills unfolded the map. Our objective is another kilometer north. Brooks nodded. If we keep this pace, we'll be there in 20 minutes. Morgan quietly studied the valley. Something didn't fit. There were birds circling far above, but none perched on the old walls. No insects buzzed through the dry grass. Even the wind seemed strangely absent. She slowly turned her head toward Bennett. "When was the last time you heard anything?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" "Animals." He listened. Nothing. No goats, no birds, no distant barking. His expression changed. "I don't know." Morgan didn't answer. She simply looked toward a cluster of boulders overlooking the trail. The radio crackled. "Overwatch to 2nd Platoon." Brooks immediately responded. "Go ahead. We've regained thermal coverage." A pause followed. "We're seeing—" "Stand by." Static interrupted the transmission. Brooks frowned. "Overwatch, say again." Nothing, only interference. Then the signal returned. "Multiple heat signatures." Static. "Unable to confirm." Another burst of interference. Then silence. Price looked around uneasily. "I hate broken radio calls." "So do I," Brooks answered. The platoon continued moving. Morgan's pace slowed slightly. She glanced toward the left ridgeline, then the right, then back toward the center of the trail. Her breathing remained calm, but Bennett noticed one subtle change. She had quietly loosened the retention strap on her medical bag. A small detail, easy to miss, yet she had done it before anyone had even reported contact. 500 yards later, the point man raised a fist. The entire platoon stopped. Everyone dropped to one knee. Brooks moved forward. "What is it?" The scout pointed toward the dirt road ahead. Fresh tire tracks. Heavy ones, not civilian. Military-sized. "They weren't here yesterday," the scout whispered. Brooks studied them. "They're recent." Morgan spoke softly. "They're bait." Several heads turned. Brooks looked at her. "What makes you think that?" She pointed farther down the road. "The tracks stop." Brooks narrowed his eyes. She was right. The tire marks disappeared behind a curve, almost too perfectly. "They want us looking down," she said quietly. "Not up." Brooks slowly lifted his binoculars toward the cliffs. Still nothing. No movement, no flashes, no figures. Yet the feeling in his stomach grew heavier. He keyed his radio. "All elements." Before he could finish, a single rifle shot echoed across the valley. The round struck a rock barely inches from the point team's position. "Contact!" Every soldier instantly dove for cover. Machine guns erupted from the ridgeline. Dust exploded around the platoon. Rounds slammed into stone walls with sharp cracks. Brooks shouted over the chaos. "Left ridge! No, right!" More gunfire erupted from a second direction. They were taking fire from both sides. Morgan was already moving. Not toward safety, toward the first wounded soldier. Private Ellis had collapsed behind a low wall, clutching his shoulder. She reached him under fire. "Can you breathe?" He nodded through clenched teeth. "Good." She cut away his sleeve in seconds. Bullet through the upper arm. Heavy bleeding. Tourniquet. Pressure dressing. Bandage secured. Less than 40 seconds. "You're staying with me." She moved before he could answer. Another scream echoed nearby. Price fired controlled bursts toward the ridgeline. "They've got us pinned!" Brooks crawled beside him. "Smoke!" 2 grenades landed between the platoon and the enemy positions. White smoke rapidly spread across the valley. For a few precious moments, visibility disappeared. Morgan used every second. She dragged Ellis behind thicker cover, then immediately crossed toward another casualty. Bullets snapped overhead. She never hesitated. Bennett watched her sprint through a gap no sane person would choose. "She's exposed!" Carter shouted. Morgan reached Sergeant Diaz just as another burst struck the wall behind them. Diaz wasn't moving. She checked him. Pulse. Weak. Chest wound. Without wasting a second, she opened his vest. Price caught a glimpse from across the valley. "What is she doing?" Bennett answered automatically. "Saving him." Morgan sealed the wound, inserted a needle to relieve pressure, rechecked breathing. Every movement flowed into the next without hesitation, without searching her kit, without thinking, as if her hands already knew what came next. Bennett had worked with experienced medics before. None moved this efficiently. The firefight intensified. Enemy rounds continued striking the rocks around them. The platoon's radio operator suddenly cried out, "I'm hit!" Morgan looked over. Leg wound. Heavy bleeding. Too far. She scanned the terrain once, then shouted, "Carter!" The young private looked over. "What?" "Apply your tourniquet." "I've never." "You practiced last week." "You can do it." Her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't panicked. It carried complete certainty. Almost without realizing it, Carter obeyed. Within seconds, the bleeding slowed. Morgan nodded once before returning to Diaz. Brooks noticed. Most medics would have run. Morgan had delegated instantly, keeping everyone working, keeping everyone alive. The enemy fire suddenly shifted. Machine guns stopped. An uneasy silence settled over the valley. Price frowned. Why'd they stop? Morgan looked toward the cliffs. "They're moving." Brooks stared. "How do you know?" "They're repositioning." "How can you tell?" She listened for half a second. "Because they're expecting us to move." Nobody argued. Brooks immediately changed positions. "Stay under cover." 10 seconds later, rockets slammed into the exact locations they had just abandoned. The explosions showered the valley with dirt and stone. Price stared at the smoking craters. "If we'd stayed." Nobody finished the sentence. Every man already knew. Several quietly looked toward Morgan. For the first time since she'd arrived, no one saw an inexperienced medic. They saw someone whose instincts had just saved an entire platoon. Still, one question lingered in everyone's mind. How could a medic with no combat deployment know exactly what an experienced enemy force would do before they did it? Even Brooks couldn't answer that. But somewhere high above the valley, watching through surveillance feeds and fragmented radio traffic, someone else had just heard Morgan's voice over the emergency medical channel. The senior operations officer monitoring the battle froze for a very different reason. He recognized it. The valley was no longer a patrol zone. It was a kill box. Smoke drifted between broken stone walls while gunfire echoed in uneven bursts from the ridgelines. The platoon had taken cover wherever instinct allowed, behind rocks, shallow trenches, collapsed terraces, but the enemy still controlled the high ground. Brooks pressed his back against a boulder, scanning for movement. "We need suppression on that left ridge," he shouted into the radio. Only static answered him. Their comms were breaking down. Again. Price slid beside him, reloading fast. "We're getting chewed up out here." Brooks didn't respond. His focus was shifting now, not just to survival, but to command. Lieutenant Mills was down, injured during the first minute of the ambush. That left Brooks effectively in charge. He looked across the chaos and saw Morgan. Still moving, still exposed, still treating the wounded like the firefight wasn't happening around her. Morgan had already set up a makeshift casualty point behind a half-collapsed stone wall. 3 wounded soldiers were there now, 4. She worked without pause. Tourniquet, chest seal, airway check, pressure bandage, reassess. Every action flowed into the next like she was running a system she had memorized long before this valley. Private Ellis grabbed her wrist weakly. "Doc, I can't feel my arm." She leaned close. "You're alive. That's what matters right now." Her voice was steady, controlled. No emotion wasted. Only instruction. Ellis nodded, barely conscious. She moved on. Bennett crawled into cover near her position, breathing hard. "You need to get down," he shouted. Morgan didn't look up immediately. "Not yet. That ridge is still active." "I know." She tightened a bandage on Sergeant Diaz's chest wound. "If I leave now, he dies." Bennett stared at her. You're going to die too if you stay out here. She finally met his eyes. That's not how triage works. Then she turned away again. Bennett froze for half a second. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't fearlessness. It was certainty based on something he didn't understand. Brooks made a decision. "Suppressing fire on my mark," he shouted. The platoon responded immediately. Rifles and machine guns opened up toward the left ridge. It forced the enemy to stay down long enough for movement. Brooks crawled toward Morgan's position. He arrived just as she finished stabilizing another soldier. "Specialist," he called. She looked up. "We need to reposition casualties further back. This spot is getting targeted." Morgan shook her head once. "They're not targeting this spot." Brooks frowned. "What do you mean?" "They're mapping response patterns." He stared at her. "That's not—" "It is." She pointed toward the ridge. "Every time you suppress left, they hit right. Every time you move wounded, they adjust fire faster." She paused. "They're not guessing anymore." Brooks looked toward Price. Price didn't like what he was hearing. "That means they're watching us." Morgan nodded. "Or they already knew we were coming." That statement hung in the air longer than the gunfire. A few hundred meters above the valley floor, in a remote observation post, a commander stared at live drone feeds. Colonel David Hargrove. Decorations on his chest didn't matter here. Only the screen did. His analysts were speaking rapidly. "Second platoon is pinned. Heavy casualties. Enemy positions confirmed on both ridges." But Hargrove wasn't looking at the ridges. He was replaying intercepted battlefield audio. A voice. Calm. Controlled. Directing movement under fire. He raised a hand. "Pause that segment." The analyst froze the feed. Hargrove leaned closer. "That medic," he said. "She just predicted the second rocket strike before it happened." A junior officer frowned. "Could be coincidence, sir." Hargrove didn't respond immediately. Then he said something quieter. "I've heard that voice before." Silence followed. The analysts exchanged looks. "That's impossible, sir," one said. Hargrove didn't move his eyes from the screen. "No," he said. "It isn't." Back in the valley, the firefight intensified again. Enemy forces shifted tactics. Instead of sustained fire, they began short, coordinated bursts. Precise. Controlled. Designed to force movement rather than kill outright. Brooks realized it too late. "They're pushing us," he said. Morgan was already scanning the ridgelines again. "No," she corrected softly. "They're hurting us." Price looked at her. "Toward what?" Morgan didn't answer immediately. Then she pointed toward the far end of the valley. A narrow gap between two cliffs. A choke point. Brooks' expression changed. "That's a funnel." "Yes. If we move there, we won't be able to move back." Brooks swallowed. "So what's the alternative?" Morgan looked at him. For the first time, her calm cracked slightly. Not emotionally, but analytically. Like she was confirming something she already suspected. "There isn't one they haven't accounted for." That sentence landed harder than any bullet. A mortar round exploded nearby, shaking the ground. The platoon scattered again. Morgan stayed low but continued working. She wrapped a bandage around a soldier's leg while speaking over her shoulder. "Brooks." He looked at her. "We need smoke on the right ridge and a withdrawal window on the left." "We don't have enough smoke for that." "Then use what we have." Brooks hesitated. That hesitation cost them seconds. Another explosion rocked the valley. Morgan didn't wait again. She grabbed a radio handset from a wounded operator. "This is 2nd Platoon Medical," she transmitted. Her voice cut through chaos cleanly. "We have multiple casualties requiring extraction. Immediate suppression adjustment needed." Static. Then a response. "Medical. Confirm identity." Brooks stared at her. Morgan didn't hesitate. "This is Specialist Morgan." A pause, then a different voice came through the channel. Low, controlled, military authority. "Copy that, Morgan." Brooks froze. He looked at her. Not because of the response, but because of the way the voice said her name. Like it mattered. Like it was recognized. Morgan closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. Not relief. Recognition of something coming closer. Up above, Colonel Hargrove lowered his headset slightly. "That's her," he said. One of the analysts asked carefully. "Sir, who is she?" Hargrove didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled up a classified archive on a secured terminal. A file opened. Redacted mission summaries. Black operations. A single incident report labeled Operation Iron Veil, Survivor 1. He stared at the name on the screen, then looked back at the live feed of the medic holding a radio in a collapsing valley, and finally said, "She's not a medic." He paused. "She's the reason that operation ended at all." The valley had become something else entirely. Not a battlefield anymore. A system collapsing in real time. Smoke drifted low between shattered stone walls. The ridgelines still spat intermittent fire, but the enemy's rhythm had changed again. Slower now, more controlled, as if tightening a net instead of firing in rage. Second platoon was running out of space, ammunition, and time. Brooks crouched behind a broken wall, breathing hard, trying to keep what was left of his unit organized. "Ammo check," he shouted. Short responses came back, low, almost gone. Price wiped dust from his face, eyes scanning the ridges. "They're pushing us toward that choke point," he said again. Brooks didn't argue anymore, because it was true. And Morgan had been right about it too many times already to ignore. Morgan moved through the casualties without hesitation. 8 wounded now. 2 critical. She had stopped introducing herself as medic in her actions. She was something else in the way she operated under pressure. Precise, systematic, almost detached, but never careless. She finished securing another chest seal and looked up. "Brooks." He crawled closer. "What? If we move now, we can still avoid full enclosure." "Move where?" She pointed toward a shallow ravine that cut across the valley floor. "Through there, not the funnel." Brooks shook his head. "That's open ground. We'll be exposed." "It's already covered," she said. He frowned. "What does that mean?" Morgan paused for a fraction of a second. Then she said it plainly. "They've already decided where we die if we stay here." Silence hit the space between them. Brooks looked at her differently now. Not like a medic, not like a junior specialist, like someone whose certainty came from experience he didn't have access to. Above them, Colonel Hargrove stood inside the forward command post watching live feeds and fragmented radio intercepts. His staff waited for him to give an order. He didn't. He was focused entirely on Morgan's movements, her decisions, her timing, her calm under fire. Then a new transmission came through, encrypted, priority channel. He keyed it immediately. A second voice entered the line, older, official, cold authority. "Colonel Hargrove." "Yes, sir." A pause, then, "Confirm visual on Morgan." Hargrove looked at the feed again. "Yes, sir, I have her." Another pause. Then the response. "Do not lose her again." The line went silent. Hargrove slowly lowered the headset. His jaw tightened. Whatever was happening in that valley was no longer just a platoon-level ambush. It was something far older, and far more classified. Back in the valley, the enemy shifted again. This time, the fire stopped almost completely. Brooks noticed immediately. "That's not good," he muttered. Price looked up. "Why would they stop shooting?" Morgan answered without looking away from the wounded. "They're preparing the final push." Brooks felt something cold settle in his chest. "Final push?" She nodded once. "They've funneled us where they want us. Now they close it." A distant sound echoed through the valley. Not gunfire. Movement. Coordinated movement on the ridges. Multiple positions shifting at once. Brooks realized what that meant. "We're surrounded." Morgan didn't correct him, because he was finally right. Then the radios came alive again. But not from Overwatch, not from command. From everywhere. Multiple overlapping transmissions, jamming attempts, fragmented voices. Then a clear signal cut through everything. Second platoon, hold position. Brooks grabbed his radio. Who is this? A pause. Then, stand by. The valley quieted in a way that didn't feel natural. Even the enemy fire paused. Morgan stopped moving for the first time in several minutes. Her head tilted slightly. She listened. Brooks looked at her. You know this voice? She didn't answer immediately. Then, yes. The word was quiet, controlled, and final. From the northern ridge, a helicopter approached. Low altitude, fast, no insignia visible at first. Then, as it closed in, markings became clear. Not standard Army markings, special operations configuration. It didn't land. It hovered just long enough for a fast rope deployment. Soldiers began descending, not reinforcements in the normal sense. Something more deliberate, more precise. The battlefield itself seemed to pause as they entered. Brooks watched in disbelief. Who are they? Morgan finally stood upright. For the first time since the ambush began, she stopped treating wounds. Because something else had arrived, and she recognized it instantly. The lead operator hit the ground hard and moved immediately toward Morgan's position. He didn't scan the platoon, didn't assess the battlefield like a newcomer. He walked directly to her, and stopped. Every soldier nearby went silent. The operator removed his goggles. He looked at Morgan like someone seeing a ghost they didn't expect to find alive. Still standing, he said quietly. Morgan nodded once. I told you I would be. Brooks stepped forward slightly. What is this? He demanded. The operator didn't answer him. Instead, he spoke to Morgan. The ridge teams are collapsing. You were right about the pattern. Morgan exhaled slowly. I know. That exchange hit Brooks harder than any explosion that day. Then another figure stepped out of the helicopter. Colonel Hargrove arrived in person. The platoon straightened instinctively, but he didn't look at them. Only at her. At Morgan. The silence stretched. Then he said her name fully. Captain Evelyn Morgan. Everything stopped. Even the wind felt like it paused. Brooks blinked. Captain, Price whispered. She's a captain. Hargrove continued. Formerly Task Force Spectre. Confirmed survivor of Operation Iron Veil. A few soldiers exchanged confused looks, but Morgan didn't react to the title. Only to the name. Iron Veil. That meant something none of them understood. Hargrove turned slightly toward the platoon. For those unaware, he said, you've been standing next to one of the most effective combat medics we ever fielded. He paused. Before she was a medic. Silence. Then he added, she was one of the operators who ended that mission alone. Brooks stared at her. You weren't just a medic? Morgan finally looked at him. No. Price swallowed. What were you? Morgan didn't answer immediately. Then she said it simply. I used to be the person they sent in when nothing else worked. The enemy in the ridges began retreating. Not because they were defeated, but because the battlefield had changed in a way they no longer controlled. Overwatch aircraft swept the valley. Precision strikes neutralized remaining firing positions. The ambush collapsed in minutes. Not gradually, completely. Later, when the smoke finally cleared, 2nd Platoon stood among the aftermath of a battle they barely survived. Wounded soldiers were being evacuated. The dead were accounted for. Morgan moved among them again, but differently now. No longer just treating injuries, checking on people who were alive because of decisions she had made. Brooks approached her quietly. We misjudged you, he said. She didn't look up. That happens. Price stepped closer. You could have said something. Morgan paused. I didn't need you to know who I was. Brooks nodded slowly. But you saved us anyway. She finally looked at him. That was the job. A long silence followed. Not uncomfortable anymore, just heavy with understanding. As helicopters lifted the wounded out of the valley, Morgan stood near the edge of the landing zone. The same calm expression she had arrived with. But now, no one mistook it for inexperience. Brooks walked up beside her one last time. "What happens now?" he asked. She looked toward the mountains. "Now you go back to training like I never existed," she said. He frowned. "And you?" Morgan adjusted the strap on her medical pack. "I go where they need me next time they can't afford to be wrong." She stepped toward the helicopter, then paused briefly, not turning back, just adding one final truth. "And try not to underestimate your medic again." Then she boarded, and the blades lifted her away from the valley that had nearly buried them all. Below, 2nd Platoon watched in silence. No one joked, no one spoke, because they all understood the same thing now. They hadn't just survived an ambush. They had survived the moment they met the one person on the battlefield who had already seen it coming long before it began. As the helicopter disappeared over the ridgeline, the valley slowly settled into an uneasy quiet. Smoke faded, radios went silent, and what remained of 2nd Platoon began the long process of regrouping. Brooks stood there for a moment longer than the rest, still watching the sky where Morgan had vanished. For most of them, it finally made sense. She was never the weakest link in the unit. She was the reason they made it out at all, and she never once needed them to believe in her to do her job. If you made it to the end of this story, thanks for watching and sticking with it. If you enjoyed it, hit the like button, subscribe, and drop a comment with your thoughts, especially on that final reveal. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know what stories you want next. See you in the next one.